Think about walking through a crowded intersection. Cars pass within inches of you, strangers brush your shoulder, and yet almost everyone navigates this chaos without a scratch. That's because our everyday physical interactions are governed by an invisible web of legal boundaries. When someone carelessly crosses one of those boundaries, they commit what the legal world calls a tort. The term itself comes from the Latin word tortum, which translates simply to twist, or to deviate from standard expected behavior. That this isn't criminal law. If you commit a crime, you've broken a written statute against the state and you might go to prison. A tort is strictly a civil wrong resolved between two private individuals. It's also entirely separate from contract law. Contracts rely on specific terms negotiated and agreed upon by willing parties in advance. In a tort, you haven't agreed to anything. Because life is unpredictable, you can't pre-write a rule for every single way a person might get hurt. Instead, tort law is largely uncodified. It is built over centuries by judges, who look at the specific facts of a dispute and decide who owes what to whom. It acts as an unwritten legal mechanism, operating in the background to clean up the messiness of human interaction whenever one person's careless twist causes a problem for someone else. To understand how torts work, we first have to define what is actually being protected. The law recognizes a concept called a right in rem. This is a right you hold against the entire world at large. For example, your absolute right to exist peacefully in your own home without being disturbed by a stranger. That stands in contrast to a right in personam, which is a right you only hold against a specific, determined person, like expecting a tutor to show up because you signed a private business contract with them. People lose money, crash their cars, and suffer damages every single day. Does every single loss mean a tort has been committed? No. In the eyes of the courts, simply suffering a real-world harm is not enough to trigger legal protection or force someone to pay you back. This diagram outlines how a court evaluates a lawsuit. A tort has to be split into two separate pillars. On one side, we have damage, the tangible, physical, or financial loss you experienced. On the other side is the injury, which strictly means the violation of a legally recognized right. There is a legal maxim called damnum sine injuria, which translates to damage without legal injury. This is a scenario where you suffer a very real loss, but no one actually broke a legal boundary. Imagine a popular grammar school that has been operating profitably for years. Suddenly, a rival teacher opens a brand new school right across the street and charges significantly lower tuition and poaches almost all the students. The original school suffers massive financial devastation. The original school owners sue to recover their lost profits. But when the gavel falls, they get absolutely zero compensation. They lose the case because business competition is entirely legal. They suffered a devastating financial blow, but the new school didn't violate any specific legal right. Without that violation, the court has no power to offer a remedy. But what happens when we reverse the formula? Welcome to injuria sine damnum, a legal injury without any tangible damage. In the historical case of Ashby versus White, a citizen went to the polls to vote, but an authorized police officer wrongfully blocked him, refusing to let him cast his ballot. Here is the twist. When the final votes were tallied, the specific candidate that the man intended to vote for won the election anyway. The man lost no money, suffered no physical harm, and his choice still took office. And yet, when he took the officer to court, the judge ruled in his favor and awarded him financial compensation. The court determined that his absolute legal right to vote had been violated. In tort law, the invisible boundary of the right itself is the ultimate asset being protected. Break the boundary, and you owe a debt, even if nobody got a scratch. This raises a practical problem. If there's no pre-signed contract and no strict criminal fine on the books, how does a judge calculate the cost of a violated right? They use a system called unliquidated damages. This means the financial compensation isn't fixed in advance. Instead, it is determined after the incident based on the exact circumstances of the case. Say you are texting and driving, and you carelessly rear-end a compact 20-year-old hatchback. You've breached your duty to drive safely. The repair bill might be a few $100s. Now, imagine making that exact same careless mistake, but this time you rear-end a pristine, vintage luxury sedan. Suddenly, your financial penalty shoots into the tens of thousands of dollars. The underlying legal violation, your careless driving, is identical in both crashes. But unliquidated damages scale dynamically. The court calculates the specific loss to restore the victim to the state they were in before you crossed their boundary. Sometimes a person's rights are threatened by activities so severe that the wrongdoer's intentions, or how careful they tried to be, no longer matter to the court. This introduces the concepts of strict liability and absolute liability. These rules apply to entities dealing with inherently hazardous activities, where the risk of catastrophic harm outweighs any normal precautions. The precedent started in the 1860s with Rylands versus Fletcher. A landowner built a massive, carefully engineered water reservoir, but the water broke through an old, forgotten underground shaft and completely flooded his neighbor's active coal mine. The landowner didn't intend to do it, but he still had to pay for all the damage. Decades later, courts escalated this rule after the Bhopal gas tragedy. In 1984, hazardous chemicals escaped from an industrial plant, creating an undeniable human catastrophe. From this, the Indian courts cemented the rule of absolute liability. If you choose to harbor something inherently dangerous for profit, the law dictates that you are entirely liable for the violation of the public's rights if that danger escapes, regardless of how many safety protocols you claim you followed. When courts face these massive, absolute liability disasters, they rely on the deep pocket theory. This means they look directly at the wealth and capacity of the enterprise responsible for the hazard. To address this, judges issue exemplary damages. Instead of just calculating the literal repair bills, the court imposes massive financial penalties on wealthy corporations, explicitly to set a systemic example. This ensures the financial sting is felt proportionally. If a giant enterprise realizes the penalty will wipe out their profits, they can't simply treat public safety as a cheap business expense. The system scales to fit the violation. Whether it's replacing a scratched bumper, compensating a turned-away voter, or holding an industrial plant accountable, the unwritten rules adapt. Tort law operates as a living, breathing mechanism. It continuously defines exactly where your rights end and your neighbors begin, actively working to balance the scales of a civilized society.